we have our Support Out and Speak Up presentation, how young people are defining well-being for themselves and what agencies can do to support them. First up, I want to introduce Aisha Canfield, who is the director of Ceres Policy Research, where she leads a national initiative called the Whole Youth Initiative, providing technical assistance to juvenile probation departments to improve how they collect data from young people, particularly LGBTQ plus youth. She also conducts evaluations with community partners to uplift community-based organizations as healing alternatives to traditional interventions for LGBTQ youth of color who are disproportionately involved in the justice system. In her personal life, she is a Black gay woman and a mother to a 3-year-old little girl. Everybody, welcome Aisha.
Hi, thank you so much, Sarah.
No problem. We also have Crystal. So Crystal Farmer is a research assistant also with Ceres Policy Research and works on survey development, data collection, data analysis with a focused content expertise on the intersections of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and gender identity. I don't know if I don't see them on, but if Crystal is on, welcome Crystal. Hopefully we see you soon.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah. All right. So take it away, folks, and welcome.
Again, thank you, Sarah, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for being here today with us. Before we jump into the data and I introduce our panelists, I want to provide some background for our participation in today's summit. Ceres Policy Research was brought on as a learning partner to conduct an evaluation of the SupportOUT initiative, to measure how the initiative, particularly the Office of LGBTQ Affairs and the county at large, add value to the lives of Santa Clara's youth, and to identify where there's opportunity for improvement. Ceres wanted to establish a baseline understanding of what well-being means for young people in the county and to operationalize that definition in a survey to be tested among a general sample of youth. With that said, it was incredibly important for us both methodologically and philosophically to center young people from marginalized communities and establishing that baseline understanding. We wanted to avoid developing a survey based off of the best thinking of adults and to avoid replicating previous surveys done with youth. So we hosted a series of focus groups with young people themselves to determine the content of our survey. We conducted focus groups with first-generation Latinx youth at De Anza Community College, homeless youth at the Bill Wilson Center, and LGBTQ plus youth at the LGBTQ youth space. Also recognizing that many of these identities and lived experiences overlap. From those focus groups, we developed a survey that was administered amongst a general youth population. Today, we're going to share those findings with you and hear from the folks working directly with these groups of young people. We hope that you'll stay tuned through the rest of the summit to hear the collective wisdom of the young people themselves. With that, I'll introduce our esteemed panelists, without whom we could not have conducted the research. So with us today is Lily Rivera, pronouns she, her, hers, and ella, who is the Puente counselor at De Anza College. She works with first-generation students throughout their community college experience. The Puente Project's mission is to help underrepresented students transfer to four-year universities, earn degrees, and return to their communities as leaders and mentors for future generations. We also have Stanley Gaeta. Pronouns are any that are given with respect, including they, she, he. Stanley is the drop-in center coordinator at the LGBTQ youth space. In this role, they support the space in creating and sustaining all essential mental wellness and LGBTQ affirming programming, including serving as a peer facilitator and supervisor. The LGBTQ youth space is open to LGBTQ youth and allies ages 13 to 25, 5 days per week, offering support groups, youth development activities, and referrals. And finally, we have Emmanuel Munoz, pronouns he, him, his, or they. Emmanuel serves as a case manager and outreach counselor at the Bill Wilson Center. They were one of 2 staff to help rebuild the LGBTQ program and LGBTQ drop-in center connections at the downtown location. They run a student housing program and lead and facilitate youth processing and life skills education workshops. We thank each of you for joining us here today and for your participation in both the focus groups and survey development and administration that helped to make this happen. So we're going to go ahead and get started by sharing the findings, and then we'll move into a discussion with the panelists. So Crystal, take it away.
So first, I'd like to start with the survey instrument itself. The survey itself had 4 sections. In the first, we asked youth to rate a series of statements asking about their well-being and the resources available to them from the following choices. It was from strongly agree, disagree, and then strongly disagree. In the second section, we asked youth to answer demographic questions about their race, gender identity, sexual orientation, and their immigration statuses and that of their families. In the third section, we asked youth to disclose whether they had been suspended or expelled from school. And finally, in the fourth section, it was meant to be more of an open-ended answer. So we asked youth to write down anything they felt that they needed to feel emotionally supported, physically safe, and hopeful about the future. At the end of survey collection, with the help of many community participants, we collected 350 surveys from youth in Santa Clara County, from 2 high schools, 3 community colleges, 1 university, and 1 youth center. We surveyed transitional aged youth, so that was anyone aging from 15 to 24, and so the average age of our respondents was 17.5 years old. The largest portion of our sample were Latinx youth, who made up 84%. Then Asian and Pacific Islander youth, who made up 13.7% of our sample. Then youth who identified as having 2 or more ethnicities, who made up 9% of our sample. Then white youth, who made up 5.7% of our sample. Then Indigenous and Native American youth, who made up 3.1% of our sample. And finally, Black and African American youth, who made up 2.6% of our sample. Respondents also varied by gender identity and sexual orientation, with 52.6% of our sample identifying as women or girls, then 44.6% of our sample identifying as men or boys, then 5.4% of our sample identifying as gender nonconforming or transgender, and 19% of our sample identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, or queer. You'll notice that we included pansexual in the actual acronym because a significant amount of our respondents who identified as being part of this community identified as being pansexual. So we decided that it was significant enough that we wanted to represent that portion of youth in the actual demographic identity categories. So for the findings, at the end of the survey, youth were asked to write down up to 3 things that they needed as a child to feel emotionally supported, physically safe, and hopeful about the future. Young people responded with a variety of answers, anything that they needed in the past, in their childhood growing up, as well as things that they needed in that exact moment when they were responding to the survey, or things that they thought that they may need. And so all of those answers were compiled into one database. Then those answers were sorted into different categories. And then ultimately those categories fit into the 3 themes that we were looking for around safety, moving forward, and supports to thrive. And so those categories were then compared to the demographics, and that's how all of these findings were found. So for safety, Latinx youth and men and boys expressed significant need for tools and practices to ensure their safety in their communities. That included anything from self-defense skills, bodyguards, or in a couple of cases, even guns, needing the tools to actually feel safe they thought that they needed. Black youth, women and girls, youth and families with precarious immigration statuses, LGBTQ youth, and GNCT youth signaled a significant need for safe spaces where they can express themselves, feel safe, and can go in case home wasn't safe. That included anything from having a safe home, a space outside of the home, or a safe neighborhood, anything where they talked about needing something in their environment to help them feel safe. For moving forward, Black youth and women and girls on average were less likely to know how to heal from past traumatic experiences. LGBTQ youth and GNCT youth indicated a need for low cost and accessible services in their community that met their psychological, medical, and reproductive needs. That included anything from therapy for emotional distress, sex education in their schools or classes, and healthcare for them as well as for their families. LGBTQ youth expressed a significant need for mental health resources in their communities to cope with emotional distress, often caused by the lack of validation, love, support, and basic needs at home. And finally, for supports to thrive, Latinx youth and youth and families with precarious immigration statuses on average disagreed that there are youth programs in their communities that they enjoy attending. Youth and families with precarious immigration statuses on average disagreed that there are youth programs in their communities where they felt comfortable being themselves. Youth and families with precarious immigration statuses, LGBTQ youth, and GNCT youth on average do not feel comfortable asking adults for what they need. LGBTQ youth indicated a need for educational resources to create a college-going culture accessible to all youth regardless of immigration status. And finally, GNCT youth expressed a need for free programs in their communities that provide support, resources that meet their needs, and safe spaces where youth can go outside of school and family life.
Thank you so much, Crystal, for sharing those really important findings. I know there's a lot of data there. The PowerPoint will be made available. But at this time, I would like to have our panelists join us by turning on their cameras, unmuting yourselves. And I'm going to jump into a first question. So for all of you, I'm wondering what findings from the data most resonated with you or your work and why. And I'll, Emmanuel, do you want to start?
One second here. Oh, I am unmuted. For me, there were a couple different things that kind of stood out. At the Bill Wilson Center at Connections, we're kind of a first point of entry, so we are lucky that we get to see a little bit of of everything. So we're able to create space for them. But for me, one of the things that really stood out was in that moving forward section when we're talking about LGBTQ youth, needing low cost and accessible services in their community, for example, for psychological, medical, reproductive needs, right? One of those things that we tend to focus on over at Connections is kind of all-inclusive sexual health education. That's not always something that a lot of our youth will get that resonates with them, right? They can identify to within their schools all the time. We don't always see fair sexual health or inclusive sexual health at schools, or at least people who are willing to have those conversations, and let alone at home, especially for a lot of our youth who are coming from places where they just don't have the home space to be themselves. Another thing that really stood out too was and we're looking at the demographic of the numbers, right? Overall, from what we surveyed, we saw that there was more of a smaller number of Indigenous and Black respondents, but sometimes, right? For example, over at Connections, what we see a lot too is we see the way that we create the space, it's kind of open for anyone to come in, right? And anyone to have the conversation and to just express themselves. So we have, whether you're LGBTQ identifying or not, or just an ally. So what that does is that it creates a lot of space for people to come in and have those conversations with you and be like, hey, I've always, felt a little different or thought of this, or Does that include me in this aspect, right, or this context? And so what happens is that we see a lot higher numbers in that, right? And so it leads me to believe that maybe a lot of the safe spaces that we have in the community, right, aren't as open or creating, a safe space for anyone to walk in that's not already identifying, right? Sometimes within communities of color specifically, it can be hard, to, say, hey, LGBTQ over here, come on down, right? Because as we all know, sometimes just outing yourself or coming in to a safe, to a LGBTQ specific space when, you have cultural and, or, religious barriers can be detrimental to your safety, to your well-being, to, to what opportunities you already have. So it just makes me really think about the way that we present safe spaces and, who we target with them too.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you brought up the intersection of race and culture and sexual orientation and gender identity, and how important it is to be thinking about those things as we think about resources and services. Lily, what parts of the data really resonated with you in your work, or why?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Lily. And for me, going over the data and having Crystal and Aisha explain, it was more of like a reflection check for me, and recognizing or like thinking back to, I'm an educator and I'm the Puente counselor. So thinking back to my lectures in my life skills class and thinking back to what I bring up. And just for me, it was like, I need to do better in including LGBT youth and to uplift stories from them, and maybe, just creating conversations where they see that they can feel safe to talk about their identity, and to uplift movies or authors or whoever it is into my classroom. So for me, it was, like, Puente does an excellent job of bringing culture into our classrooms and to our counseling sessions, and talking about the importance of our Latinx identity, but also including gender as part of that. So for me, it was more of a reflection to do better.
Thanks, Lily. I'm sure a lot of people are going to be listening to this or throughout the day thinking about the ways in which we all have opportunities to do better in thinking about LGBT youth. And I think can be hard for folks to admit that there's a learning edge. So I really appreciate you sort of setting the tone for that. Stanley, I'd love to hear from you. Same question, what from the data most resonated with you or your work, and why?
Hi, everyone. Thank you. So yeah, I would say just, again, kind of with the folks that I've interacted with kind of on a day-to-day basis at the space, and really focusing on the presentation, I feel like safety was a huge theme of what was really resonating, and like perceived sense of safety for our folks, especially living locally, and for individuals who are really kind of expressing themselves authentically, what really goes into those identities. And then also when we're looking at the data and seeing like people of color, and then also like queer and gender nonconforming, it's like, what does that safety look like for folks? So like specifically, I think with the Latinx youth, men and boys who express a significant need for tools, I think that relates a lot to kind of the work that we do, and just trying to maintain and kind of promote more education within our space. I think Emmanuel talked about it really great, where there's that sense of am I choosing to express my LGBTQ identity? Am I willing to access these resources? What am I needing to feel safe just walking home, taking public transportation? I'd say public transportation is probably like the biggest form of access for our folks. So again, like, what does that look like when they're needing to go home? We've done really great education in terms of collaboratives locally, for different like self-defense tactics, for folks that also kind of like represent their community or see themselves in really who's kind of supporting with that seminar or workshop. But I think really perceived sense of identity plays a lot, and that can look more than just kind of like physicality of what's to be aware of. But again, like when even seeking out mental health resources, the stigma that kind of comes with that, and, you know, really being open and feeling safe to share and to access these resources. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I think it's, I'm glad you bring up like public transportation. You know, the data talked about needing safe spaces, even safe spaces that are outside. And I see opportunities potentially for other city or county-wide public agencies to think about, how do we make public transportation safer for this population? How do we make our parks and recreation safer for this population, or certainly more accessible? So I'm really glad you brought that point up. The research found that Black youth, women and girls, LGBTQ and GNCT youth, and youth and families with precarious immigration statuses all disclose a need for safe spaces to express themselves. And so much of our work is sort of in silos. People are doing women and girls work, folks are looking at Black youth and immigration. And here the data shows that despite the differences in identity and lived experiences in many ways, we're sort of all sharing these same needs. How does your work support these groups all together? I know we've sort of started to touch on this, especially with you, Emmanuel. Or what are the opportunities to serve these groups and improve their real and perceived sense of safety? So really thinking about the differences in these groups and how we think about them differently, but also drawing from the data and seeing that there is a sort of similar shared need. I'll let you all choose who wants to go first.
I mean, I don't mind going first. I really like that question a lot. Yeah, like I was saying earlier, one of the things we try to do really at Connections, and for those of you guys who really aren't aware of what Connections kind of looks like, Connections is kind of a drop-in center, right, for LGBTQ youth, and well, for everybody, but LGBTQ youth focused at our enclave in downtown San Jose, right, which is a part of a greater kind of structure of buildings and a campus almost, right, for first point of entry for homeless youth. One of the things that we really enjoy doing too that kind of relates to this question, right, about coming together, working at a silos, is that for a while, you know, Connections was kind of just LGBTQ, right? And that's kind of how it started out when it was first started. So, you know, it would always be sending in, getting referrals for students who are, or for youth who are just LGBTQ, and not really, you know, creating, you know, open doors or open conversation outside that space, right? One of the things that we really enjoy, because we had the opportunity of being part of the enclave and being part of that little cluster of buildings too, was that we were able to change that a little bit, and we opened up the conversation to everyone, right? We made workshops that were open to everyone. We had guest speakers, and or we would have we would rotate where certain workshops or where certain conversations were had, right? That way it wasn't just this kind of peg thing of just, oh, just have it at, you know, at Connections, right? And so what that did, right, was that it created exposure for everyone, right, to be part of these conversations, to be, you know, to be included in these activities, to really be exposed to, you know, narratives and to, you know, firsthand experiences by people that they may see but never have talked to, right? Or people that they may recognize in their own families, right? Or in their own lives. And it really resonated with them, so to where, again, they were able to open up and talk about, you know, and connect, right, those experiences with their life, right? And then kind of see themselves in other, you know, in other groups. And so that really started changing the culture of the entire enclave in general, where now, right, that protection and that safe space, right, for LGBTQ folk wasn't just in Connections. It started spreading around to the entire enclave, and where people who did not identify as, you know, LGBTQ would actually step up and, you know, defend that safe space, right, for others when they were seeing, you know, seeing things being, you know, safety being violated. So that was really awesome too. And then that eventually poured out into, you know, because, you know, our youth, you know, are homeless, so that would pour out into their own spaces too, out on the street or in their encampments, right? So I think really opening up those doors and just making that network and, you know, sharing each other's spaces, right? Bringing the conversation outside of just your silo, because even though you may think that other people have already heard this, sometimes it just takes one person to really hear it and to be like, wow, we really haven't reflected that in our own space. Let's start working on that, right? Let's start making ourselves visible, right? And realizing that everyone is everywhere. So
Thank you. Stanley.
Yeah. So I think again that question can be kind of broken down, and then also not speaking as like an ambassador for any of these communities, but really just kind of sharing some of the real experiences of the folks that, you know, again, we connect with. I think when looking at the data and looking at like a small percentages of folks, like specifically like individuals, people of color, and specifically of the Black community, it's kind of like what are we doing to kind of uplift the small operation services that are existing and to kind of create more support? Because I would get, I mean, I would just kind of say, from hearing from a lot of our folks, and even just in reference to like our space, is kind of like, where's the representation, and then where do you kind of find community with that? I think we at our space, something that's I'm very fortunate to kind of help with co-facilitating in a lot of our weekly support groups is, along with one of our other kind of peer interns, is doing this Color of Truth, which is a cutie POC specific. And although it doesn't highlight specifically through the Black experience, it is, again, wanting to bring more conversation to the intersectionality, and again, really what are our youth experiencing or wanting, so that we can kind of bring it to light through conversations like this. That's something that I think I'm really fortunate to be a part of, in also providing more perspective again for kind of LGBTQ youth seeking at that safe space where it's not really as accessible, I'll say, in schools or in their home situation to even just kind of have those conversations. Sometimes there's a lot of code switching between where my identity, you know, where can I share my identity in this safe space? Again, kind of going back to like that safety concern and what is that perceived sense of safety for a lot of our youth. So I think sometimes it could be like not having enough geographical resources. Again, we were talking about like public transportation, and you know, it kind of again goes back to the safety, because even with access for folks who are able to access our space through public transportation, we are wanting to maintain that safe space with all of the individuals who may like just kind of come across our space or may not even feel comfortable to come in. So there's a lot of things that we kind of do within our kind of community guidelines, I guess, to maintain that safety, really just for all LGBTQ IA identifying folks. And then again, not being really like an ambassador for like any of the communities, but again, focusing on like individuals with precocious immigration statuses. A lot of what I hear is that for folks, you know, sharing information, it's like, will this information be used against me in some way? And I think, again, it just really goes back to that perceived sense of safety for all of the identities that our folks hold, and really seeing how we can uplift a lot of the small operation services that are already kind of doing the work in our community, as well as kind of, again, collaborating more, creating more opportunities where folks feel represented and seeing themselves in, and again, providing that sense of community and relationship where it may not be available to them in their everyday kind of home life. So I would say, while in the shelter in place, again, just kind of talking about the Color of Truth, like cutie POC support group that we have going on, that's a way that we've been able to kind of maintain that connection, aside from what we already have going on, like with our Transformers group, as well as I would say for like gender nonconforming group, really keeping that conversation alive of like maintaining pronouns, even just kind of within our Zoom meetings here, and just kind of starting that conversation, and kind of ways that we're going with the shelter in place, but still trying to be progressive within our own programming, as well as like with social media, which I think some folks have mentioned. A lot of folks have felt, young people have felt really connected with different things that maybe we've been able to highlight, as well as even doing polls for what they're wanting to see, which is how the Color of Truth group came about. So yes, thank you.
I'm glad you mentioned, rural areas, and I just want to highlight that, of course, just like there are going to be differences in needs between folks with different identities, geographic location is also going to make a really big difference. So, the county is not a monolithic county. There are lots of cities with lots of different access and resources. So it's going to be really important for services in various parts of the county to really think about who's in their own community and their surrounding area, and really tailor those needs to that specific community's culture, understanding, etc. So I'm sorry, I have background noise, so I'm going to continue to mute myself. Of course, they're doing construction right now. But so Lily, I'll kick it over to you and go back on mute.
Yeah, I think again, for me, I'm someone who doesn't specifically work with LGBT. So again, I'm constantly focusing on the room for improvement. But as a counselor, I think what I could provide, and also reminders for whoever's in the room that are educators or work directly with people every single day. I think as a person who works with youth, it's really important for me to like know their names, for example, just something as simple as that. Or, I think LGBT, there's still a lot of stigma around it, and there's stigma around mental health. So creating a safe space for students and for youth to talk about feelings, right? I think in my life skills class, it's hard for them to communicate even just feelings. So just having a space to talk and to create dialogue around all of these topics. So for me, continuing to do that, and to, even if they are like, I don't want to do this, Lily, or I don't find the importance of this. It's that fear that's talking, right? Like there's fear around talking about being vulnerable, right? So yeah, creating those spaces for students.
Thank you so much for that. And I think that's what makes this survey method, while it's not something that is necessarily always sustainable, I think the filling out anonymous survey gives us an opportunity to hear from youth who feel vulnerable, and certainly sets us up and gives us a nice foundation to continue, hopefully, to collect some data from young folks in a really systematic way, so we can continue to track outcomes and changes in outcomes over time. So I want to pose one more question and then give the last maybe 10 minutes or so of the panel to open it up to the audience. I think we have a couple of questions that I have not looked at yet. I'm sorry, y'all, but I am aware that they're there. This is sort of a bonus question, so sorry to throw it at you without any prep, but I'm curious because homeless youth, LGBT youth, youth of color, youth from low income communities, and youth with who come from families with precarious immigration statuses can sometimes be difficult to reach, we even without a pandemic. But I'm really curious, what opportunities does the pandemic pose for us to think about how we reach these otherwise sometimes difficult to reach communities, and to sort of integrate whatever changes we're making in this moment in a long-term and permanent way? I'm putting y'all on the spot because I know we didn't talk about this, but I know you all are in the thick of it right now and thinking about this anyway, so I'd just love to hear.
I mean, for us over the Bill Wilson Center, when it comes to outreach, right, and making sure we're reaching our students during the pandemic, or our youth, excuse me, we still run basic outreach services. Of course, everything is COVID compliant and safe, but whether we still go out in the streets, we still create networks. Of course, having that open space and welcoming space downtown still running, right, is kind of key. connection, the enclave downtown is always going to be open, and we're going to make sure to keep it open for a lot of our homeless youth we work with, right? To be kind of a safe point to come back to, whether they find themselves in different counties. They always know they can at least call or reach out to us, right? And we can connect them with whoever we know out in different counties or in different areas of the county itself in Santa Clara. But we still run regular outreach services too. So we will still have our outreach, case managers and counselors go out into the community, out into encampments, out wherever we can find our youth or where we know where they may be at, right? And connect them with resources and services, right? We also make sure that when we do that, we're not just going out there providing one-stop shops. We're also giving them aftercare and access and resources to be able to reach out should they need anything else and we not be available in that moment. Of course, we're still continuing on our workshops and everything, both in person and also online as well too, through Zoom when we can, especially for a lot of our foster youth or youth who are entering placements, which is really helpful for them because that way they know that they can continue to receive that support wherever space they may find themselves in next, right? And then finding a way to be able to bring that and loop it all back around and full circle it into making sure, should you need to come back, you always have a home here with us, or reach us here on spot in campus, right? Of course, COVID compliant, or we can do one-on-ones. We have no problem meeting you where you're at, and I think that's kind of been our best defense during to COVID challenges, is making sure that we meet you where you're at and how you need the support given to you.
Thank you so much for that. Stanley?
Yes. So just kind of immediately what comes to mind is hearing and continuing to adjust our programming and tailor it based off of whatever our youth safety is, whatever we're able to see what the youth or the individuals who were, or participants who were supporting, kind of what spaces they're needing in that moment, and how we can kind of bring that and kind of encourage forms of like leadership in some way, at least for our services, so that we can kind of maintain these influential and really supportive spaces, like a lot of the support groups that I was mentioning. Again, I think creating new forms of connection and community while in shelter in place is something that we've been kind of continuing to do and been able to maintain from our programming from before. I think really looking into and investing even after maybe social distancing is a little bit more or differently tailored than currently. I think a lot of the like online connection that we've had is something that I've had personal interest in seeing how we can expand beyond this. I think this was a really great learning opportunity for us to see like what we have, I guess, in a sense, had a platform for, but haven't necessarily been able to invest when talking about geographical locations. Even sharing from a specific story from like our youth was that, especially while in the beginning of the shelter in place, a lot of our support groups that we were transitioning to more of an online space.
Stanley, I think you might be on mute. I think we lost.
I'm sorry about that. So when really, I was just sharing briefly about one of the stories of our youth who actually got a chance to connect with our services from a remote distance because of the shelter in place, and how we were really fortunate, and what that really spoke to in terms of we should be investing more and creating more representation and kind of platforms and community from our online platforms, I guess, where folks are still feeling really connected to the youth space and the work that we're doing. And that there's a real sense of value in that, especially when talking about like safety, and maybe for folks who are not feeling, again, safe at home, but maybe during that like hour of our support group, they feel validated in really just their identity, even if, they are out of like city guidelines or city or out of state. So I think there's a lot of, for me at least, when looking at the space and maintaining our programming, I think really looking and staying in tune to what our folks are wanting. How could we expand and kind of grow continuously with the times, and always be a resource for our folks and let them know that we are here in some way, even if that is just virtually.
Yeah, thank you. Staying in it with young people, I think, is particularly important across sexual orientation or gender identity. So Lily, you will take it away, and then I'm going to jump into the Q&A from the audience.
Yeah, so for us, I work at a community college, so we have the option of doing asynchronous or synchronous classes, which means you would perform your class all online or do it online and virtually. So Wenta has decided to do it online and virtual, which means our students have to meet on Zoom. They have to log in at a certain time for the classes that they have to take for our program. And we always incorporate some kind of icebreaker or get to know you activity. I've incorporated accountability partners within my class. So they have someone that they can go to for help if they miss a class or if they miss an assignment, whatever, or just to have a buddy in the class or someone that they can meet because they're all strangers. I also incorporate like TikTok into my classroom and having them do like a little voting challenge, or there's TikTok challenges out there a bunch. So incorporating that, but trying to make it fun, and also I mean, they're there for community, right? And to feel like they belong on campus. So remembering that they want to get to know each other. So we give them that space to socialize with one another. Also, the Puente statewide office does a good job of, well, we can't do conferences in person, so we're going to bring this dope speaker. Like we've had Dr. Cornell West talk to them and Las Cafeteras. So they try to do it, they try to do things more special since we can't be in person. But yeah, I think the key thing is really having those Zoom sessions and encouraging everybody to have their cameras on and to participate.
Thank you so much. Oh, go ahead.
Add one more thing really quickly. I think Stanley just reminded me of something really important, which was, in that moment where he was, they're talking about how that youth may have that 1 hour of time where they feel validated. And I think because how things are so uncertain right now, consistency is really, really key when it comes to supporting our youth during COVID time, and to make sure that they draw that bridge afterwards, whenever this may be over, right? To make sure that they can feel it's reliable. So if, for those of you thinking into, starting a program or a workshop, I would definitely just recommend to make sure that if you are going to start a new program, right, start it if you can. But if you can, commit to being consistent about it. That's definitely going to be key to making sure that that we're serving our youth the best that we can.
Thank you so much. Speaking of dope speakers, I want to thank the three of you and Crystal, of course, my dear colleague, for being here and participating in this today. We just, again, at Ceres, data is incredibly important to us. It's what we do, but it doesn't matter if it doesn't feel accessible or useful for the folks on the ground or the community that was so generous enough to provide us the data. So thank you all again. I want to jump into some questions really quick. So Teresa de la Cruz, which community colleges participated? How were students for the survey identified? And how was the process communicated to those students? I'm wondering if you would be okay with us sending you a message directly about the methodology. And that's something that Crystal could do for you. And we can go back and forth if you want a ton of detail. Noemi Ortiz, what would help the youth feel more comfortable attending programs? Is the personnel working there a sense of not feeling accepted? Should we be talking about it being okay to be part of the LGBTQ community? Just trying to figure out how we can help the youth we serve at the different locations. And they say thank you. Thank you for that question. Whoever wants to respond, I'll let you all handle that.
So I definitely think that Thank you for that question, by the way. I love what you said about is it the personnel working? I think it's absolutely important to make sure, especially for those of us here who may be leaders that are in, at our organizations or agencies, right? Or direct staffing. I think it's definitely important to make sure that we are hiring people with lived experience. I think it's definitely important to make sure we're hiring, to make sure that we're representing the people that we're serving, right? There's this efficacy looks so much more different when we have leaders and staff who our youth can connect with, right? So make sure that you are hiring LGBTQ folks, right? Make sure that they are represented at the table. They are represented in decision making, right? Because that's going to create, that's going to affect how we influence and we design programs, right? With LGBTQ folk in mind. So I think that is absolutely key. And also, it goes beyond just hiring, right? Hiring is one thing, but also making sure that you are creating a supportive environment, right? For not just the youth, but also your staff, right? Who are LGBTQ identifying, right? And so that, again, includes, making them part of conversations where decisions are going to be made as well, too, right? And that goes for, for race, religion, color, for, LGBTQ, whatever it may be, just make sure that you have that on site. The other thing I like too is definitely talking about, showing that it's okay, right, to be LGBTQ, but also going beyond just the basics of like, oh, well, let's just talk, about tolerance and let's just talk about, sexual health. Cool. Let's throw, as much as important as it is, right? It can't just be throwing an HIV course out there. It has to be a little bit more than that. It has to be more in depth. It has to talk about, our day-to-day, who we are, our challenge that we face, the intersections, right, that we may find ourselves at, right, and how that affects us. And because all that will affect how your youth navigate through your program, right? So it's important to talk about those things.
Did either of you also want to respond to that question? I know we're coming down to the last minute and there are lots of questions coming in, but I want to give you all an opportunity to respond to that first one. And if not, I can keep sort of moving through them.
Just to be very brief, I would say that I would say always, like, whenever creating programming, I personally like to always just view like my personal like identities that I hold and how I can continue or further like my allyship with whatever group or specific participants that I'm like serving in that moment, or just in general. I would say just again creating that space, but then kind of going beyond what we would, I don't know, I guess like generally when thinking of like LGBTQ youth, like it goes beyond for like some classrooms than putting like a sticker saying like this is a safe space. It's kind of like, what can we do to further our allyship and to kind of create more of that safety amongst folks. I guess really having those conversations, normalizing like pronouns is something as simple for like our folks to really like not only validate them, but again, not kind of have our folks start the conversation, and sometimes that can feel like exhausting, or just different things of whatever they might be going through. So that's kind of an example that I would like to take, is just kind of really reevaluate and be mindful of like your role as an ally and how you can kind of continue that in all spaces, like even just beyond the workspace.
Great. And Stanley, we had a question for you directly from Tony Gonzalez, education specialist from the Bill Wilson Center. Are you open to having, where did it go? Oh, it just popped off. Okay. Are you open to having a collaborative Zoom youth group with other LGBTQ service providers? They've recently had a higher volume of trans youth utilizing their services, and they're hoping to connect them to a safe space via Zoom like Youth Space where they know they'll be taken care of.
Yes, absolutely. I would say, I mean, just roughly like 70% of the folks who attend our space identify somewhere within the trans or gender nonconforming kind of community. So I would say just kind of looking into even just the information that we were talking about and how intersectionality plays into that, I would totally be open to collaborations.
Great. Thank you. We got a question. What support is offered for those involved in the justice system? What conversation would you have with their probation officer to help them be more comfortable in addressing their mental health needs, as well as the conditions set forth by the court? Angelica, I just want you to stay tuned. We are working on a project with Santa Clara Probation to start doing trainings to collect SOGI data. And part of that will be really hands-on technical assistance and coaching to work specifically with LGBT youth in the justice system. So stay tuned for that. That's coming down the pike very soon. And there was another question. There are many, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. How can general healthcare workers, not necessarily sexual health focused or specifically mental health focused workers, provide better support to this community? For example, care in the emergency room, routine medical visits, etc.
So I think, it's as much as we would like to think that, despite the fact that we are in, this California bubble, right, that we are meeting the needs and identifying and acknowledging our LGBTQ folk in those spaces, there's still a lot of work to do, obviously, as you know from asking that question. So sometimes it's, even just to start, right, even to acknowledge the people who are in the room with them, right? During cases of emergency or during cases of visitations and routine medical visits, right, sometimes we want to put people one-on-one, or we don't recognize their support, right, their support groups that come with them. Sometimes that one or two extra people that come with them may be that support that they need, the only person that they have to share about, and it's important for them to ask. Of course, you want to be HIPAA compliant and make sure that you are that you're not oversharing anything that other people shouldn't hear. But sometimes even just recognizing the folks in the room and asking that person, your patient, are you, who would you like to be present, makes a difference, right? Especially when it comes to things like partners, right? Like your relationship partner. We still sometimes will face discrimination when it comes to who can be in the room with you. And I think just also recognizing that presentation is not always how a person identifies. So asking for pronouns and respecting, right, their identity.
Thank you so much. So I'm getting the notice they're going to pull the curtain on us very soon. So I just want to say we got lots of comments that you all were an incredible panel. I could not agree more. So I'd like to figure out how to get answers to the rest of these questions. Maybe there's a way to share email addresses and all of that, so you can reach out to our panelists, or certainly Crystal and I directly. Thank you all again for your time. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Crystal, for all the work you do for Ceres. You're an incredible researcher. And thank you all for letting us be here today.
Awesome. Everybody, round of applause, and do it up in the chat for this wonderful panel. Thank you, Liliana. Thank you, Stanley. Thank you, Emmanuel, for being wonderful panelists. And thank you, Aisha and Crystal, for bringing Ceres to SupportOUT. So excited. All right.